Online Stalker. When Lucy was 18, her life revolved around the internet, where everything felt anonymous and fascinating. Discord was the app she often used to talk to strangers, seeking comfort in those conversations. And then, Lucy met Nook. She immediately noticed Nook because of his difference. Nook seemed cool, attractive, and mysterious, often wearing a mask. They clicked instantly, messaging each other with ease. Nook became a part of her life. They talked every day, sharing secrets, laughing about things only they understood. But things started to feel different. Nook's questions became more personal. He wanted to know everything about Lucy, asking where she lived. Casually, she mentioned California, thinking it was vague enough. But then he said he also lived there and wanted to meet her. At first, she ignored it. But now the messages were coming more frequently, becoming an obsession for Lucy. She was starting to feel scared and disturbed. One night, Lucy's parents went on vacation to celebrate their wedding anniversary, and she was home alone. She closes the curtains, locks the door, and spends time relaxing in front of the TV. And then, it happened. A soft knock at the window behind her. She turned, realizing she had forgotten to close the curtain. She always had the eerie feeling of being watched, so she quickly rushed to pull the curtain shut. Just then, her phone buzzed with a message from Nook. "Let's meet right now." She froze. How did he know she was home alone? She replied, saying she was busy. His response sent chills down her spine. Nook said he knew she wasn't busy. He could see her. Panic set in, and she vowed not to reveal anything to him. He explained that he had tracked her location using Snapchat. He knew exactly where she lived. Then she heard a knock at the front door. Nook was here, threatening her to open the door. She sat frozen, paralyzed with fear. Her mind raced. The knocking persisted, his voice growing more insistent. She texted him, begging him to leave, but he replied with a chilling calmness, saying he wouldn't leave and would stay until she opened the door. She knew she had to do something. Slowly, she stood up and opened the door, hoping this was all just a misunderstanding, praying it was some weird joke. But there he stood, tall, menacing. He smiled as if she were a game he'd just won. Then he stepped inside. Lucy kept telling him to leave, but he ignored her, his demeanor shifting instantly. His smile faded, and she could feel his anger rising. Then, he suddenly took off his mask. His face was scarred, with jagged lines around his mouth. She begged him to please leave, but he didn't respond. He just grinned, a deranged, twisted smile, and rushed towards the kitchen. She followed, her steps driven by fear. When she saw him grab a knife, she froze in terror. Then, she turned and ran. She dashed out of the house, hiding in the bushes outside. Her hands shook as Lucy dialed the police. Minutes felt like hours. She could hear him laughing, calling her name, his footsteps coming closer, then fading away. Finally, the police arrived. They found him hiding near the kitchen, still clutching the knife. He was taken away, but what sent chills through me was the way he stared at me, calm and collected as they led him away. Her parents returned home after the police called them. They tried to comfort her, but the haunting memories of that night would never leave her. His twisted grin, the scars, the knife, everything was etched deep in Lucy's mind. She could never be alone in the house again. Every creak, every shadow reminded her of him. How dangerous a stranger on the internet could truly be. Horror Story Haunted Tracks. The legend of the haunted tracks had always been a topic of eerie fascination in our small town. The story went that, decades ago, a tragic train accident had occurred on the old, abandoned railway line just outside town. Many lives were lost that fateful night, and it was said that the spirits of the victims still lingered, haunting the area. As a skeptic, I never believed in ghosts or haunted places, but that changed one cold winter night. I was driving back home after visiting a friend when a heavy snowstorm hit, making the roads nearly impassable. I decided to take a shortcut through the old railway crossing, hoping to save some time. The wind howled, and snow fell in thick, blinding sheets as I navigated the narrow, winding road. The visibility was almost zero, and I had to slow down to a crawl. As I approached the old crossing, my car suddenly stalled. I tried to restart it, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Frustrated, I got out to check under the hood, the biting cold stinging my face and hands. As I fumbled with the engine, I heard a faint, distant whistle. I froze, remembering the tales of the haunted tracks. The whistle grew louder, and I saw a light piercing through the snowstorm, heading straight toward me. Panic set in as I realized it was an old steam train barreling down the tracks at an alarming speed. I abandoned my car and tried to run, but the snow was too deep and I stumbled. As the train approached, I could see it more clearly. A rusted, ancient locomotive, its windows shattered, and the metal twisted and scorched. I braced myself for the impact, but it never came. Instead, the train passed right through me, sending a bone-chilling cold through my body. I turned to see it continue down the tracks, disappearing into the storm. Shaking, I returned to my car and tried the engine again. This time, it roared to life, and I wasted no time getting back on the road, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally reached home, I was too shaken to sleep. The next day, I told my friend Mark about the experience. Mark, a local history buff, was intrigued and suggested we investigate the site together. Armed with flashlights and a camera, we headed to the old railway crossing that evening. The storm had passed, leaving a calm, clear night. The tracks looked abandoned, covered in snow and rusted with age. As we walked along the line, Mark recounted the details of the accident. A collision between two trains due to a signaling error, killing dozens of passengers. Suddenly, we heard it again, the distant whistle. The air grew colder, and a light appeared down the tracks. We watched in disbelief as the same ghostly train emerged from the darkness, moving silently toward us. Mark, braver than I, stepped forward with his camera, snapping pictures. The train passed through us again, leaving us both shivering and breathless. When we reviewed the photos, we were stunned. In each shot, ghostly figures were visible, faces twisted in pain and fear, hands pressed against the windows as if pleading for help. We had captured the spirits of the victims, forever trapped on their final, tragic journey. The haunted tracks were no longer just a legend. They were a grim reminder of the lives lost and the restless souls that still wandered, seeking peace. I never took that shortcut again, and the memory of that night remained etched in my mind, a chilling testament to the power of the supernatural.
Two children without eyes. The setting sun cast long shadows over the quiet suburban neighborhood. Ivy, a young woman in her 20s, was walking home after work. The streets were unusually empty, and the air carried a strange chill. As she turned the corner, she noticed two figures standing under a flickering streetlight. They were children, a boy and a girl, around 8 or 9 years old. They stood unnaturally still. Ivy wheezed. Steps slowed as she approached them, a growing sense of unease with each step, but it was the only way for her to get home. The children simultaneously turned their heads, and Ivy's breath caught in her throat. Their faces were pale and expressionless, but what struck her most were their eyes, or rather, the absence of them. These children had smooth, empty voids where their eyes should have been. The eye sockets were dark and hollow, an abyss that seemed to pull at her very soul. Ivy's heart pounded as she stopped a few steps away from them. The boy and girl began to move, their movements unnaturally stiff. They stepped towards her, their empty sockets somehow feeling like they were staring menacingly. Ivy wanted to run, but her legs felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The children reached out, their hands pale and cold. They lightly touched her, sending a chill through her body. As their fingers met her skin, images flooded Ivy's mind. She saw dark hallways, old, decaying houses, and a profound sense of sadness and fear. The disjointed images, like mismatched puzzle pieces, kept flashing through her mind. Suddenly, the children let go, and the images stopped. Ivy stumbled back, gasping for air. The boy and girl stood there, silent and still. The flickering streetlight cast eerie shadows on their faces, making their hollow sockets appear even darker. Ivy ran, her heart pounding. She didn't stop until she reached her home. Slamming the door shut, she leaned against it, trying to calm her frantic breathing. The encounter had left her shaken, and the images from those children still lingered in her mind. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the eyeless children and the haunting images they had shown her. She knew she had to find out who they were and what had happened to them. The next day, Ivy returned to the spot where she had seen the children, but they were gone. She began asking around the neighborhood, describing the children to anyone who would listen. Most people shook their heads, saying they had never seen or heard of such children. But an old man at the local library seemed to know something. His eyes widened in recognition when she described them. He told her about a tragic accident that had happened many years ago. 2 children had died in a fire at an old house that once stood on the very street where Ivy now lived. Their bodies had been found, but their eyes had mysteriously gone missing. The house had been abandoned and eventually demolished, but it was said that the children's spirits still haunted the area. Ivy felt a chill run down her spine as the old man spoke. She realized that the images she saw were the children's memories, their plea for help. Determined to soothe their spirits, she decided to search for the remnants of the old house. It took many days of searching, but she finally found it. It was a patch of overgrown grass, hidden behind a row of new houses. As she stood there, she felt a presence around her. The air grew colder, and she knew the children were near. Ivy knelt down and began to dig. She uncovered charred pieces of wood, the remains of the old house, and then she found a small, scorched box. Inside were 2 porcelain dolls, their eyes missing. Ivy's heart ached as she realized these were the children's cherished toys. With trembling hands, she placed the dolls back in the box and whispered a prayer for the children's souls. The air around her seemed to lighten, and she felt a gentle breeze brush her face, as if in thanks. Relieved, she knew she had done the right thing. The eyeless children were no longer bound to their tragic past. and perhaps she had helped them find their way to the afterlife.
The freak in the morgue. The coldest place in the hospital is likely the morgue. Stainless steel drawers holding the dead stretch out like a cold, metallic labyrinth. The air is thick with the scent of antiseptic. I am a forensic pathologist. Today, I'm on shift, preparing my tools for my work. Tonight, I noticed something strange. Foreign objects have appeared during autopsies before, like a rusted coin or a few plastic beads. This isn't the first time something unusual has shown up during an examination. I stepped into the storage room, searching for some necessary items, but a few tools were missing. My eyes were drawn to a drawer slightly ajar. I pulled it open to find an empty space, feeling like something was missing, but I couldn't immediately identify what. A strange feeling washed over me, and I couldn't quite grasp what was happening. I hurried out, moving quickly down the dark hallway. I saw something move in the shadows. A hunched figure, resembling a man, dressed wildly with disheveled hair, was obsessively examining some medical equipment laid out before him. I couldn't believe my eyes. Horrified, I saw a clump of hair, a severed finger, and other small body parts. He held them as if worshiping and collecting them. I felt nauseous and disgusted by him, but I forced myself to stay because I knew I needed to do something. I hadn't finished my work yet. Suddenly, the man stopped and looked around, sensing something. I held my breath, praying I hadn't been seen. I rushed to the office, my hands trembling as I called the police, reporting the break-in and what I had witnessed. The dispatcher on the other end sounded shocked, but assured me that help was on the way. I hung up the phone, but I couldn't get that horrifying image out of my mind. Who was he? And what was he doing? Suddenly, while trying to find a place to hide, he spotted me and chased after me, as if he wanted to make me his next victim, the next piece in his collection. I ran as fast as I could, desperately searching for a place to hide. Fortunately, the police arrived just in time, and perhaps he realized that it was no longer just the two of us. He became distracted, giving me a chance to escape. I managed to escape and crouched behind the desk, eyes fixed on the door, counting every second until the police arrived. The police burst in and found the intruder in a frenzy, as if he had lost his mind. He was caught off guard, his crazed eyes wide with panic. The officers quickly subdued him, wrestling him to the ground as he snarled and fought like a cornered animal. They handcuffed the man and began searching the area where he had been, uncovering his gruesome collection of stolen medical tools, body parts, and a disturbing array of personal items taken from the corpses. His twisted obsession and grotesque passion were fully revealed. I stepped out of the room, still trembling, as the police led the intruder away in handcuffs. The man glared at me with pure hatred. The morgue, once a place of routine and order, had become a site of horror, tainted by human depravity. As the first light of dawn broke, I stepped outside, knowing I had done the right thing and acted quickly. The dead had already suffered enough, and it would have been a tragedy if they were not kept intact. I turned back to the morgue, locking the door one last time. The memory of that night would haunt me, but it was over. I had survived the worst. Head in the swamp. Every summer, our parents would take us on vacation. We always stayed in a secluded cabin in the woods. I was excited because we were finally old enough that our parents allowed us to go to the lodge on our own for the first time. When we arrived, we parked on the gravel road beside the lake and then had to take a boat about 700 meters across the lake to reach the cabin. It was quite small, with only a kitchen, a bathroom. At night, it was pitch dark, with no street lights, and the only light came from the moon. One thing I didn't like was that there were no curtains for sleep. The first few days were wonderful. I spent time exploring the island's natural beauty, hiking through dense forests that I had never experienced before. It was quite interesting, a perfect getaway to escape from the busy life. On the third night of the trip, we built a campfire by the swamp. The full moon's pale white light sparkled on the lake's surface. We were stargazing when we suddenly heard splashing, as if something was moving in the water. Rank stood up abruptly and pointed, saying,
"What the heck is that?"
I followed his direction, staring into the darkness, seeing nothing but more darkness because it was quite cloudy that night. A sense of fear spread through me. The hair on my neck stood up, and I got goosebumps. I felt frozen with fear. In the middle of the lake, it floated on the water's surface, staring at us. It looked pale from being soaked in water for a long time, with long black strands like human hair. Its hair was matted with water, the rest submerged underwater. We tried to tell ourselves that it was just an owl, but that's what we tried to convince ourselves. We threw more wood onto the fire and tried to forget about it, but it still made me feel uneasy. About an hour later, I went to the edge of the pier and looked out over the swamp bathed in moonlight. I noticed that the thing was still there but had moved closer. It still looked like a head, but it was unclear if it had a nose or not, and it still seemed to be staring at me. An overwhelming sense of discomfort filled me as I realized it couldn't be a bird. I told Rank what I had seen, but he didn't dare come down to the pier to take a closer look. We tried to tell ourselves that it was just a log or a branch floating on the water. I could understand that we all felt uncomfortable. None of us really believed it was just a log. We went inside the cabin and shut the door, locking it behind us. It was very late, and we needed to sleep. None of us mentioned the thing in the lake and tried to avoid talking about it. Since there were no curtains on the windows, I couldn't help but glance out the window one last time. I could see the lake clearly illuminated by the full moon, but the thing was no longer there. It had completely vanished. I sighed in relief, thinking it was just a log that looked strange due to the lighting. That night was very hot, and we had to sleep with the windows open. I found it hard to sleep even though I had slept there a few times before. As I lay there, I thought I could hear someone walking around the cabin. I closed my eyes tightly and tried to tell myself that it was just my friend from the other room looking for food or going to the bathroom. But the footsteps sounded wet. The sound of footsteps reached the steps of the cabin door and then gradually faded away. As I began to gradually fall asleep from exhaustion, everything started happening again. Rank said we needed to leave. I asked why, but he just insisted we needed to leave quickly. He kept saying,
"Let's get to the boat and go."
Rank was sweating, shaking, and quickly packing all his things without bothering to be neat. I had no idea what was happening, but I felt worried and suspicious. All I could do was ask him what had happened. He just stood there, staring with a terrified look in his eyes. I will never forget what he said. He told me that when he turned over in bed to get more comfortable, he suddenly saw something like a headless figure in the upper right corner of the room. When he said that, I felt a chill run through my body, and I held my breath with what I had just heard. We realized that if the figure was headless, then could the thing we saw in the swamp have been its head? I felt like I was going to throw up. Rank told me.
No more talking.
I started to believe it was real because, as friends, we couldn't abandon each other. We grabbed our bags and ran out of the cabin. As we rushed down the front steps, I glanced to the side and saw wet, bare footprints. But when I rubbed my eyes, they were gone. Over the rough path, we untied the boat and sped away. I had a strange feeling that someone or something was watching us. When we finally reached the other side of the lake, we secured the boat, stuffed our backpacks into the car, and drove off. On the way, we called our parents to tell them what had happened. Rank was terrified, and I didn't know what to do because I had no idea what he had seen to scare him so much. I kept asking, but I didn't get an answer. Our parents told us just to come home safely and quickly. My friend's dad went up to the cabin a few days later and said he didn't see anything unusual. However, he did mention finding wet, bare footprints around the cabin, which he found odd. What Rank saw at the window really affected him. After going through such a terrifying experience, Rank had trouble sleeping and needed to seek therapy. Since then, he always needed to take some medication to be able to sleep. Over time, he recovered and eventually got better. But even now, he still can't sleep unless the curtains are completely closed. To this day, I still can't explain what we saw on the lake that night. I have never gone back to that cabin. Ghosts in the warehouse. I am a warehouse worker for a small business in my city. I just do certain tasks that need to be done each night. I unload the goods that are delivered and place everything in its proper place. Most of the time, I just wear headphones and listen to music while I work because the warehouse isn't too big. It's rare for someone else to be working overnight with me. The night drags on slowly. The warehouse is eerily quiet, with the only sound being the creaking of the old building. My shift started at 10 o'clock, and there were perhaps some knocking sounds between 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock a.m. I stopped, took off my headphones, and tried to listen to the sound again, but it had stopped. As I returned to work, the knocking resumed, this time louder, more persistent. I froze. Facing the source of the sound, a narrow, dark aisle flanked by towering shelves. The knocking stopped when I reached the aisle, leaving only darkness. As I neared the front of the warehouse, I noticed the front door slightly ajar. Confused, I recalled that I had locked it when I arrived. I walked up and pushed the door open, finding the latch broken. I quickly locked the door again, this time jamming a nearby metal bar against it for extra security. But the gesture felt futile. Determined to finish my shift, I returned to my duties, but my focus was shattered. Every creak of the building, every flicker of the lights felt like a warning. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered and went out, plunging the warehouse into darkness. I pulled out my flashlight to cut through the blackness. The beam revealed only empty aisles, but the feeling of being watched lingered. As I moved through the warehouse, the flashlight caught fleeting glimpses of shadows darting out of sight, too quick to be fully seen. My fear surged as I raced towards the front door. I saw the metal bar I had wedged into the door bent and twisted. I turned to face the darkness, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The light revealed a tall, indistinct figure watching me from the shadows. I started breathing rapidly. The figure moved slowly towards me, its footsteps echoing loudly in the silent warehouse. In a last desperate act, I threw the flashlight at the figure and dashed into the darkness, hoping to find another way out. My frantic sprint led me to the back door of the warehouse, but just as I was about to escape, the door slammed shut, as if someone from behind had done it. I panicked and turned around, but as I was about to run back, my flashlight suddenly flickered back on, illuminating a reflection of myself in a large mirror hidden behind some old boxes. But it wasn't me. A darker version, with a blurred face, slowly raised its hand, moving while I stood frozen. It seemed to be hypnotizing me, trying to pull me somewhere. It said, "Follow me," and then gave a terrifying smile. I stumbled, too frightened to think, and grabbed the door handle, yanking it with all my strength, then ran outside, gasping for air as the fog seemed to swallow me whole. As I ran, I heard footsteps again, echoing through the mist. I turned around, but the warehouse was almost invisible through the thick fog. I collapsed to the ground, exhausted, as I turned back to face whatever was chasing me, but there was nothing there. I pulled out my phone and called the police, trembling with fear. When they finally arrived, they thoroughly searched the warehouse, but found no trace of an intruder. If I hadn't realized the door was broken, I would have faced that strange thing directly, with no way of knowing what would have happened. Although unlikely, I can't shake the feeling that it's still chasing me. So I quit the job, hoping I'll never encounter it again.